A SEAL mocked her rank on the training field that hot afternoon, pointing his finger at her chest in front of the tents and trucks and the line of young operators who were watching. And she did not flinch, did not blink, did not even raise her voice. She just said, "You think you run this place now? Step back from me, Chief." And the yard went quiet like someone had turned off the wind. Her name was Captain Mara Keene, small and steady in dusty camo, hair tied tight, sleeves rolled, a battered notebook in her left hand and a range pass clipped to her pocket, and the man leaning over her was Chief Petty Officer Blake Rourke. Tall, broad, sunburned, a legend to his team, jaw clenched with the kind of confidence that grows when people always move out of your way. And this was the first time. All week someone hadn't. He laughed loud and said, "You're just here to tick a box and slow us down." And the team snickered because laughter can be a shield when the air gets tense. Then he flicked his eyes at the notebook like he might knock it from her hand. Mara did not move. She only tapped the notebook with one finger and said, "Your radio's out of frequency. Your casevac grid is wrong. Your range card is reversed. And your demo line is running through a dry wash that will flash when the storm hits at 1,600. If you keep this plan, someone will bleed for an error you could fix in 5 minutes. I will not let that happen." And the snickering died out in a ragged way because everyone could feel the edge in her words. Blake stepped closer and said, "We've been doing this since before you showed up," stretching that last word until it wasn't respect anymore, and he pointed past her at the vehicles and shouted to his team, "Mount up," like he could end the scene by ignoring her. But Mara stayed where she was and said, "Chief Rourke, you are on my range, under my safety authority, with my medevac and my helicopters. You move when I clear you and you shoot when I say go. You don't have to like me, but you will not roll out with broken comms and a bad grid." And she raised the notebook so he could see the red marks all across his plan and the 3 clean options she had drawn under it, each with timing, airspace, and fires deconflicted. He stared at the paper like it had insulted him too and said, "Who even are you?" And she answered in that same calm voice, "Range Control OIC, Air Ground Integration Lead, and your mission controller for this cycle. If that is not enough for you, then try me on results. 6 rotations without an injury, 0 blue on blue. 4 mission saves in real-world calls because the drills here were hard and the details were right. Now fix your radios, correct your grid, pull the demo off that wash, and be ready in 20 minutes. And she turned to leave. Blake said, "You don't turn your back on me," his tone hard. And for a second the whole yard bristled like dry grass in a spark, hands tightening on straps, breath held, eyes flicking toward the duty shack where the range safety officer stood frozen. And Mara only stopped long enough to say, "Chief, I'm not your enemy. I'm your insurance policy." And she walked toward the comms tent without hurrying, like she trusted the ground under her boots. The young operators stood. They're caught between pride and curiosity until one of them said, almost to himself, "Our grid was reversed on the card. I noticed it too." And nobody laughed that time. They should have stormed off angry, but the sky was already shifting. Heat shimmer on the far hills, a dark smear on the horizon, thunder like barrels rolling. And Blake knew storms in this valley could turn dry gullies into roaring traps. So he grabbed the radio from his shoulder and said, "Confirm frequencies." And the radio squawked with static because Mara had been right about that too. So he snapped his fingers and 2 men hustled to the comms table where young tech was already spinning dials. The team moved fast now, fixing things without saying they were fixing things, because under the jokes and the swagger they wanted to come home with every man they brought. They swapped the casevac grid to the correct 8 digits. They rerouted their movement to avoid the wash. They wrapped DT cord in a new path. And by the time the dark edge of storm touched the far ridge, they rolled. As the convoy pushed out, Blake looked back at the control shack and saw Mara on the roof with binos. In a headset, rain light on her face, as steady as the poles holding the windsock, and it got under his skin that she looked more like a shepherd than a judge. The training problem was simple on paper. Raid a mock depot, secure intel, extract on a time gate before a notional enemy QRF boxed them in. But training never stays simple when weather and humans get involved. The first phase went smooth because details were finally aligned. They hit the perimeter, cleared the fake rooms, grabbed the staged hard drives, and moved toward Exfil Point Bravo where the valley pinched into a 1-lane road. And that was when the sky broke like a bucket. Rain slammed the dust flat. Wind ripped tents sideways. Water rushed down the slopes in brown sheets. And the wash that would have been under their old demo line turned into a wild river in minutes. Mara's voice came clear on the net. All call signs. Be advised. Flash flooding observed along the Bravo axis. Switch to strip lemur on the alt plan. Chalk 1. You are tight on fuel margins. Say state. The pilot answered with numbers nobody liked, and Mara said, Copy. We changed the math. Ground team. Hold of the old stone culvert and mark with IR. Adjust approach over the south ridge. You're going to get rotor washbounds from the canyon chop. Expect heavy shear at 50 feet. If you cannot control it, I will wave you off. Ground team. Pop smoke only on my call to avoid confusion. Blake felt it then, the way a voice can fill a team with shape and calm. And he found himself answering copy without the sarcasm he had used earlier. The first bird tried the approach and got slapped. Sideways by a gust the shape of a fist. Mara waved it off fast and clean, then told the pilot, Hold the ridge. We bring you a better LZ. And to the ground team, we are blowing a doorway at the culvert to gain cover. Then you move single file through. 1 meter spacing. Count off every fifth man. Blake, you own the tail. He almost said, That's my call. Then stopped because she was already thinking 3 moves ahead of him and because it was working. The team flowed through the narrow. Concrete like coins sliding down a slot, water up to shins, shoulders scraping slime. But the culvert cut the wind and gave them a clean approach to a small gravel patch just big enough to be called an LZ. The second bird rode the gust like a wild horse and flared hard. Skids down. Crew chief yelling, Move, move, move. And the first 6 men ran for the door. Then the hillside above them let go. It started as a hiss, like sand poured from a bucket. Then boulders and timber crashed down and a man at the edge screamed and went under. And Blake didn't think. He just threw himself to where the voice had been and grabbed a sleeve under brown water, his knees slamming a rock so hard he saw white. I have him, he shouted, while the pilot lifted into the chop to avoid being buried, and the rotor wash turned the rain into knives. That was when the lightning hit the far ridge and the radio went to garbage, every word eaten by static. In the control shack, Mara watched it happen like a chess player staring at a board that just cracked, and her hand moved to a small guarded switch that was never meant for training, a switch that tied a second antenna with a different encryption profile into her net. She flipped it without asking permission, and her voice cut through the static like a line in a storm. All call signs. Switch to backup net. Code word rain room. Authenticate now. And she rattled numbers so fast even the pilots had to scramble. The backup net was not part of the published plan, and that made some people on base very nervous. But in the canyon it saved minutes, and those minutes saved a life. The second bird came back low, the crew chief reaching out with both arms, and Blake shoved the wounded man across the skid with a grunt that echoed in his teeth. 2 more team members piled on, and the bird lifted, disappearing in brown spray. The rest of the team hunkered in the culvert mouth while stones hopped past them like angry frogs. Mara said, Stand by. I'm bringing you thunder. And on another net entirely, she called the weather cell for real-time telemetry, then a nearby artillery battery that was offline for maintenance, and asked for a single smoke shell on grid she fed from memory, not to hit anything, but to mark the edge of a wind channel she could see on her tablet. The smoke drift showed a pocket where the rotor shear would be calm for 5 seconds. At a time, pilot, on my count, drop through the pocket and hold for 3 men. Then up and out. We do this in slices, she said. Blake hated that plan because it meant leaving men in chunks, but it was the only plan that didn't ask the weather to stop being weather. They moved in slices, 4 at a time, each bird fighting the gust like a wrestler, each man counting steps and feeling the timers in his bones. Between lifts, water climbed their boots and the culvert roared. Blake stood at the back of the line soaked and angry and alive, not at Mara but at the sky itself. And when the last bed lifted with him inside, he looked out through the open door and saw the wash explode where they would have been if they had stayed with his original route. And he did not say anything into the headset because sometimes silence is the only way to show respect. Back at the range, soaked to their bones, they lined up with steam rising off their gear. Blake walked toward the control shack without swagger now and found Mara in the doorway with her headset around her neck, hair plastered to her forehead, notebook stuffed into her cargo pocket like a flag. He said, "We made it because of you," and he meant it, but she shook her head and said, "You made it because you moved when it mattered." And for the first time all day they looked at each other without walls in between. Then the base XO trotted up with 2 security officers and a face like a storm that didn't know where to land and barked. "Captain Keene, you engaged a classified net during a training evolution. You triggered an audit. Who authorized that?" And he turned to the security men like he expected them to handcuff her. The line of SEALs stiffened at once, an instinct to close ranks around a person who had just watched over them. And Blake stepped forward before he thought and said, "I'll answer that." But Mara touched his forearm and said, "Stand easy, Chief," then turned to the XO. Her voice stayed calm as ever. "Sir, you will find the authorization in next kilo of the base continuity plan, signed 2 years ago. It allows the range OIC to bridge nets during extreme weather or medical risk to preserve life. I logged it at 1538. The recording will show it." The XO blinked twice because people rarely blocked him with paperwork that clean. He recovered fast and said, "Even if that's true, you called the battery for a smoke round. That is off limits." And she said, "Sir, I requested a non-standard meteorological marker per the same annex. The round fell in an unoccupied zone. Safety fans were clear. My log reflects it. The battery log will too." The XO opened his mouth again, then closed it very slowly because a new voice came from behind him, a voice like gravel and old rope, and everyone turned. An older Marine with a silver oak leaf and a scar down his cheek was stepping out of a Humvee, and his left sleeve was folded and pinned where a hand used to be. He squinted at Mara and said, "We've met," and the yard went quiet again. Blake looked from the colonel to Mara and saw a flash of something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Loss, maybe, or a memory that still burned. The colonel nodded once and said to the XO, "Stand down, Jack. If Keene bridged nets, then lives were on the line. That's what that annex is for. And if..." She called for Smoke to read the wind. Then she remembered a lesson paid for in full. The XO looked angry, then wary, then careful, and he finally muttered, "Yes, sir," and backed away. The colonel faced Mara again and said, "I heard your voice in Helm and Whisper 3. You were the air boss who stayed on when our JTAC went down. You kept the net alive, and you talked my team out of a valley that wanted to eat us. I never forgot that cadence." And every operator on the line felt the ground tilt a little because the woman they had doubted had already pulled men out of fire before any of them knew her name. Blake said, very quiet, "You were Whisper 3. And Mara answered without any show, "I was one of many voices doing a hard job." And the colonel shook his head and said, "Don't make yourself small, Captain. Not today." Then he looked at Blake like he was measuring him for the first time and asked, "You Rourke?" And Blake nodded, heart thumping because the colonel's reputation was heavy. The older Marine grunted and said, "I know your file. Good man. Hard nose. Hates losing. Keep that. But listen when someone saves your men. Pride doesn't breathe for them when the water rises." And Blake said, "I hear you, sir," and he meant it. The colonel walked off with the XO, and the yard breathed again. The young operators drifted toward the trucks, talking low and bright the way men do when a scare is ending. And Blake stood with Mara in the slack sunlight that sometimes follows a storm and said, "What you said to me at the start, about being an insurance policy, I didn't get it then." And she said, "You weren't supposed to. You were supposed to lead your men." And he nodded. He looked at a notebook like it held the map to a life he had not tried to read. Then he took a breath and said, "Come put eyes on our plan tomorrow, before we brief. And if you see holes, rip them out. You have my word there won't be any pushback." She said, "Your word is enough," and it felt like a bridge being built in the open. They walked toward the flagpole where the puddles reflected a clean slice of blue, and just when it seemed the day would settle into its after-story, a jeep skidded into the yard with a siren burp. A young MP jumped out waving a paper and shouted, "Captain Mara Keene, you're needed at Ops right now." And Blake's chest tightened because the kid's face carried the look people get when bad things are moving fast. Mara took the paper without fear and scanned it, her eyes flicking. Then she turned to Blake and said, "An actual call, not training. Small recon team stuck on the live-fire range past the West Ridge. Comms lost at the height of the storm. They tried to cross the wash and got split. The words hit harder because of what they had just lived through. Ops wants me at the air desk. I need a ground lead who knows this valley like his heartbeat, she added. And Blake knew what she was asking and why. Trust is always a two-way road. He said, I'm in. Without clearing it with anyone. They piled into the Jeep and tore across the base while the sky still leaked on the edges and the smell of wet dust was everywhere. Inside the ops building, screens lit the walls, voices tangled, maps flickered with red tracks, and the air tasted like adrenaline. Mara slid into a headset and the room changed around her like iron line finding a magnet. Her hands moved across the map. She pulled weather. She called towers. She set aircraft in holding. And she drew a corridor through the mountains. Full one shot at a pickup. Blake leaned over the table and pointed to a contour the satellites flattened but men's feet knew. And he said, right there. There's a false ridge your wind model can't see. It will motor a light bird on approach. Push the track 20 meters south and you'll find clean air hugging the slope. And she adjusted without ego because she liked answers more than pride. They launched 2 birds and a rescue truck that could swim. And Mara's voice was a rope that connected them. She found the first 2 wrecker Marines up a dying cottonwood on a rock island, boots in a tangle of roots and eyes huge. She slid the burden on Blake's shifted track, and they loaded those 2 like wet sandbags, and they were shaking so hard the crew chief wrapped them in straps. The second element of the wrecking team was deeper, across a canyon cut that didn't exist last week. The only patch of ground flat enough for a skid was under a leaning wall of mud that could break at any breath. The pilot said, no chance, and the room got still. Mara said, we changed the problem, and she grabbed a coil of rope from the gear pile like she could throw it through the radio, but Blake snatched it from her and headed for the door with 3 operators in his wake. We do a ground pull to the bed, he shouted, and she stared at him 1 heartbeat too long because sending people you just save back into danger is the hardest part of the job. Then she nodded once and said, take the south approach. Watch for undercut banks. Hold at Angels 3. Eyes on Blake. Count your fuel by seconds. The rescue truck churned through brown water. The men belayed off its frame, the rope line dancing like a live thing. And the whole base seemed to hold its breath while they crossed. When Blake reached the last 2 wrecking Marines, 1 conscious and 1 slumped with a head gash, he clipped them fast, yelled tension, and felt the pull snap his ribs like a band. The wall of mud groaned. The pilot dropped through the pocket exactly on Mara's numbers, skids kissing a rock with a shudder that rattled bolts. Crew chief screaming, now, now, now. And Blake shoved bodies onto the deck and rolled in after them as the wall let go and the bird leapt, the rotor disc brushing chunks of earth as big as dogs. They skimmed out like a stone on a pond. The crew chief cursing with joy. The room in. Ups exploding in noise and relief. Back on the pad, the medics took over, and Blake slid off the deck to the concrete and lay there flat, feeling the whole world spin. He looked up and saw Mara standing over him, not smiling, not crying, just steady, like someone who had ridden out the same storm inside a different kind of weather. He said, say it, and she said, you led well, and he laughed once because he had been braced for a lecture. The colonel limped up again, eyes wet in a way that had nothing to do with rain, and he looked at Mara and then at Blake and then at the team and said, people think rank is metal on your chest or cloth on your shoulder. It is not. Rank is who steps forward when the air turns bad and the ground begins to move. It is who can make a room choose courage. We just saw who that is, and he put his one hand, on Mara's shoulder and squeezed once. The base photographer showed up because someone always does after the danger passes, and he raised his camera and caught a frame of the colonel with his hand on Mara. Blake standing to one side with mud up to his waist and a tired grin like a man who has decided to change his mind, and in the far background the storm sliding off the ridge like a curtain being pulled, making the sky bright at the edges. Later, people would say the day turned here, that respect moved like a tide, that a loud place learned to listen to a quiet voice. That night, the teams gathered in the mess, not for ceremony, just for food and relief. Someone set a tray in front of Mara and someone else swapped her soaked boots for dry ones without asking. The small ways people say you're one of us when they are learning how. Blake sat across from her and said, tomorrow, we fix the plan before breakfast. And she nodded. Then he hesitated and added, there's something I should admit. Years ago, hell meant My team got pinned in a grape field and the only voice that made sense on the net kept calling herself Whisper 3. I never knew if that voice was a myth when made to feel brave. I think I just met her, and she looked down at her hand for a long second and said, it was a hard day, and nothing more, because she didn't like turning old pain into a stage. The room hummed soft and warm. Outside, the concrete steamed under the moon. The young operators drifted past the table to drop quiet thanks. A word here, a nod there, a promise to listen better next time. And for the first time since she had arrived, Mara let her shoulders sink half an inch like a load had been set down. A week later, under a clear sky that made the ridges look close enough to touch, the teams ran the same raid profile again, this time with a plan built like a bridge, each bolt checked, each line clean. Blake briefed first and then stepped aside for Mara, and the men listened the way people do when they know the cost of not listening. The run was fast, crisp, exact. When the birds lifted out with the last chalk, everybody felt the solid click of a job done right. Back on the line, Blake turned toward Mara with a grin ready. And that was when a convoy rolled through the gate with a group of visiting brass. And at the front was an admiral who shook hands like he was swatting flies and a public affairs officer with a clipboard. The admiral walked past the teams and went straight to Mara, and Blake braced himself for empty praise or stage photo. Instead, the admiral stopped, saluted her first, and said, Captain Keene, on behalf of commands you will never visit and people you will never meet, thank you for the ways you have held nets together when everything else was falling apart. And he handed her a letter, not a medal, just paper with real ink and real names, a simple thing that matters more because it is quiet. The admiral moved on and the yard stayed still, and Blake felt another old opinion break and fall away inside him like ice off a roof. He stuck out his hand and said, No, that sounds wrong. Mara, whatever you need from my team, you say it. We are here to work. And she shook his hand and said, Whatever you need from me, ask. I'll be there. And the grip held. Later, when the sun went low and the day cooled, a young SEAL asked Blake what had changed him. And he said, she answered arrogance with facts, then risk with action, then fear with calm. I used to think rank was a loud voice. Turns out it can be a steady one. And the young man nodded and stared at the horizon like he was trying to memorize the shape of that lesson. Months later, far from that base, Blake's team would step into a real valley that tried to eat them, and a voice on the net would line their fear into something like courage, and men would come home who might not have. And when people asked in the bar how that day turned, Blake would tell a shorter story than this one and end it with a picture he kept on his phone. A woman with a notebook, a scarred colonel's hand on her shoulder, a yard full of men who had just relearned what respect looks like, and a sky clearing after a hard, honest storm. And the room would go quiet, and even the loud ones would listen. Because once a person has heard the right reply the right time, they do not forget it, and the echo of it keeps working long after the tents are folded and the range goes still.